Muy buenas tardes y bienvenidos. Good evening and welcome to the much anticipated lecture of The Saving Grace of Stories by our esteemed guest, novelist Sandra Benitez. My name, if you can hear me well, can you? My name is Patrick Bar-Melech, and I'm a professor of Latin American history and a faculty member in our Latin American Studies program, and I'm truly honored to be introducing a literary craftswoman who brings the complex and compelling experiences of Latin Americans and her own to readers all over the world, and whose sensibility and prose have seized the hearts and gripped the minds of so many. Before sharing a few thoughts with you about our special guest, and on behalf of the Latin American Studies program, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors whose support made this event happen. The Committee on Lectures, funded by the government of the student body, the Center for Excellence in Arts and Humanities, the Center for American Intercultural Studies, the Latino Studies program, the International Studies program, the Departments of History, Foreign Languages and Literatures, English, the Spanish Club, the Miller Lecture Fund of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and the Multicultural Task Force of the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs. Moreover, I wish to single out the Chair of Latin American Studies, Professor Kathy Leonard. Where are you, Kathy? There you are. For her steadfastness and support along the way. The Latin American Studies program is an interdisciplinary academic and programmatic initiative to bridge the conceptual distance between this campus community and Latin Americans here and abroad. And I'd like to thank those compañeros and compañeras in the program with whom I've had the pleasure of working and collaborating. I'd also like to announce that a question and answer session will follow tonight's talk, so I'd invite you, with questions, to approach the microphone after the lecture. Moreover, our guest will be signing books available for purchase over there at the end of the evening. And lastly, students are invited to attend, and everyone, but students in particular, are invited to attend a special reading and discussion with Sandra Benitez tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. in Hoover 1312. I first assigned one of Sandra Benitez's novels, The Weight of All Things, a couple of years ago in my course on rebellions and revolutionary movements in 20th century Latin America. It was my first foray into the literary talents of an individual with whom I would later learn I shared some commonalities, including a certain genetic hybridity, biculturalism, as well as being a frustrated but aspiring fiction writer as a 30-something, just as she was. The Weight of All Things is a perfect book to use in my course, and if you would indulge me for a moment, I'd like to tell you why. Its greatness not only lies in the specific tale that our guest wove of a boy with faith searching for his mother, who, as we learn, was a victim of El Salvador's horrendous violence in the early 1980s, but also in the fact that her story transcends, in many ways, its very plot, its very people, its very temporality. You see, The Weight of All Things, and her other novels, I would argue, are the stories of 1,000 people, of 10,000 people, of hundreds of thousands of people in Latin America who over so many years have faced destitution, loneliness, petulance, death in war and political violence, in tragedies experienced by the numerous but known about by so few, especially here in the United States. And above all, her stories give voice to those often unheard: Salvadoran servants, coffee pickers, small farmers, hotel chambermaids, Mexican paper flower makers, all with hard lives, but all who still love, labor, and live the lived life. Indeed, our guest's novels remind me of an observation made by the celebrated Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges. He said, "A book is more than a verbal structure or a series of verbal structures. It is the dialogue it establishes with its reader and intonation it imposes upon his voice, and the changing and durable images it leaves in his memory. A book is not an isolated being, it is a relationship, an axis of innumerable relationships." The Weight of All Things followed her first two novels, A Place Where the Sea Remembers, set in a Mexican village, Santiago, and Bitter Grounds, set in El Salvador. They preceded Night of the Radishes, which takes readers from Minnesota to Oaxaca, Mexico, and its yearly festival, after which the novel is named. A Place Where the Sea Remembers won a Minnesota Book Award and a Discover Award from Barnes & Noble, while Bitter Grounds won an American Book Award from the Before Columbus Foundation. In its review of A Place Where the Sea Remembers, the New York Times wrote this: Mrs. Benitez's descriptions of people and places are crisp, and the staccato rhythms of her prose are just right for this dark fable of a story. She has built a little world and filled it with people we care for, we root for, and whose flaws we are willing to forgive. And the following was said of Bitter Grounds: a story of passion, politics, death, and love. This is the kind of book that fills your dreams for weeks. Those were the words of Isabel Allende, author of House of the Spirits, of Love and Shadows, Portrait in Sepia, and so forth. So many memorable novels. Our guest's work has been translated into 8 languages, including Spanish, and I learned this evening over dinner, Icelandic, and is frequently included in high school and university reading curriculum. In addition, she teaches creative writing and lectures near and far. She is a past Keller Edelstein Distinguished Writer in Residence at the University of Minnesota and was recipient of the Knapp Chair in Humanities at the University of San Diego, and moreover, recently completed her first nonfiction book, Bag Lady, a memoir, the triumphant story of loss, illness, and recovery. In 2004, our guest, who the Boston Globe has called a remarkable storyteller, received the Hispanic Heritage Award from the Hispanic Heritage Foundation at a ceremony at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., which was broadcast on NBC and, more importantly, Telemundo. Past honorees include the late and very great Celia Cruz, Plácido Domingo, Anthony Quinn, Isabel Allende, Rita Moreno, and the incomparable and sorely missed Tito Puente. That's some pretty good company, I'd say. Not bad for a person who didn't start writing fiction until she turned 39. And getting started wasn't easy. One night, early in her career, she traveled to Fargo, North Dakota, amid winter's uncompromising fury, to deliver a lecture. One person showed up. Almost ready to throw in the towel, deflated and demoralized, Sandra returned home to her suburban Minneapolis abode, only to find a message on her answering machine. It was from a press offering her a book contract. The literary world, especially the corner of it related to Latin America and to Latin Americans, is so very pleased that she didn't give up. Ladies and gentlemen, damas y caballeros, the novelist Sandra Benitez.
I have to step on this little stool so that you can see me. Buenas noches, good evening. I'm so happy to be here. I'm especially happy to have had the opportunity to email back and forth for about 2-3 months. Patrick Barmelech, el profesor, I told him recently in a email about 2-3 days ago, I said, in the 12 years that I've been traveling around the country doing lectures and readings, you are the most hospitable and the most accommodating host contact I've ever had, and I truly mean it. I'd like to... It's wonderful. I'd like to thank the Iowa State University for inviting me. I'd like to thank also the Latin American Studies program who made this possible, and Professor Kathy Leonard, the chair of the Latin American Studies program. Thank you so much. And the steering committee also for your mandate, really, to keep the Latino culture alive and well at Iowa State. I'd like to spend some time tonight talking to you about the saving grace of stories. And I'd like to demonstrate the connections between Latinos and Americans, our intermeshed borders, and our interwoven realities. And I'd like to explore with you how our stories bring to light the spiritual and the emotional roots that define us, los Latinos. For to look at who we are is really to look at our beginnings. And only by remembering ourselves, remembering who we are and where we come from, we can come then full circle to all the selves that make us up. For me, I'm Sandra Abels Benitez. And I call myself sometimes a gringadorican, which that's my own invented term for all the selves who've made me me. A mixture of birthright and place. Gringa, because I was born in Washington, D.C., because my father, Jim Mabels, was a Missourian. And not too far from here, in Unionville, Missouri, you know, if you follow 35W, almost till you get to Missouri and hang a left at Leon, and then go to Centerville, Iowa, and then cross the border, you get to Unionville, Missouri, and that's where my father grew up. And I later went to school, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. So that's the gringa. That's what makes me the gringa. But I'm also Dorian because I grew up in El Salvador. So soy salvadoreña también. In that case, San Salvador. And I'm a Rican because my mother was Puerto Rican. So, you know, I'm una mezcolanza. I'm just a real mix salad of cultures. And a cultural stew, I call it. So you throw to this cultural stew, you throw in the juice and the spice of Mexico, where my sister Anita was born, and where our family lived for a number of years. And then you add to that the sedate dash of my beloved Minnesota, where I've lived with my husband, Jim Condrick, for 30 years. And then you get sort of a glimpse of who I am and what I am. I once wrote a little ditty in Spanish about this roving journey of mine. I'm going to read it to you in Spanish first and then in English. It's truly a little ditty, okay? Soy Sandra, de madre puertorriqueña, de padre gringo, pero criada en México y El Salvador. Soy Sandra, también de Missouri y finalmente de Minnesota. Soy Sandra, la gringa dorican. Soy Sandra, punto final, y se acabó. I am Sandra. My mother was Puerto Rican, my father Midwestern, but I was raised in Mexico and El Salvador. I am Sandra, also from Missouri. I am Sandra, the gringa dorican. I am Sandra, dot at the end, and that is all. So being this sort of mishmash that I am, a world of stories have always whirled inside my head, but I never thought to write them down. I never dreamed of being a writer. To me, I was reading all the time. To be a writer, you must be a reader. I was a voracious reader. My parents were, and they modeled this wonderful thing of sitting in a chair or on a soft couch or up in bed, propped up against the headboard with a book in their lap, being transported by story. You could tell this transportation in the way they looked as they were reading the story. And it was interesting because as I grew up in Mexico and El Salvador, I was never read to as a child, something I did so much with my children when they were born. But in Salvador in the 40s and 50s, it didn't seem like we did this. But I saw what stories could do to my parents as they sat there and read. And so I never thought to be a writer. To me, writers were like sort of rock stars. You know, they had it was incredible that anybody could, out of their brains, their imaginations, tell a story like you could find in books. I just never thought I could ever do that. And so I didn't dream of being a writer until I was 39, and I was 25 years ago. I was in Minnesota, and I was working as a translator and a liaison at a company in Minnesota, and I was tired and I was traveling a lot to El Salvador and Mexico and Central America doing business, that I decided when I had some time to go to a writing class. And I went to a writing class connected with one of the high schools in Minnesota, Hopkins High School. There was a adult writing class in the evenings, once a week on Tuesdays. And I went to that class. And in that class, I started to write little vignettes, and it was amazing what came out of me. These little vignettes of living in of my life. It still never occurred to me that I would write a novel, but for the first 3 years, the teacher said that I was quite good at what I was writing, and that's when I decided, well, if I'm that good, I'll just write a novel. Why not, you know? But about that time when I was writing those little vignettes, I found a book. I found a book in used bookstore, and it was by a man called John Hicks. The title of the book was Side Glances. I'm sure you can't get it anymore because I think the book was like 1925 or something like that. But I was enchanted by this little book. And in one of the pages, John Hicks says, the way to get ideas is to be the kind of person to whom ideas come. He wrote, it isn't a conscious search necessarily. To do it, you need inside you a soft waxed area that will take a soft impression the moment something touches down. That image of a pool of soft wax sort of molding around our hearts with things to come laying this impression, soft impression, made a deep impression on me. And after absorbing that quote and really thinking about it, I was certain that that had happened to me. I had happened to have this, and that I had many stories pooling around my heart. The first time something very impressive happened to me was in 1945 when I was 4 years old. We were living, my mother and father, myself and my sister Anita were living in Mexico. The war was on, and my father decided to join the Air Force. So we left Mexico City, and we came to Unionville, Missouri, Leon, Centerville, and population 2,000. It's still, by the way, 2,000. And we went to my parents decided to leave my sister and I on the farm with our nursemaid, Mexican nursemaid, Maria Luisa. I was 4 years old. No, I was 3.5 years old. My sister was a year and a half old. Maria Luisa was a Spanish speaker. She could not speak English. Grandma Hazel could not speak Spanish. Grandpa Orion could not speak Spanish. And just little Sandy was bilingual. So I, for 3 months, was responsible for Maria Luisa's stories. I was responsible for being her transporter of stories, and also the person who for 3 months, I was the only person she could talk to. Can you imagine having to rely on a 3.5-year-old? I didn't know it then, but I think that I was starting to be a writer then, because Grandma would say to me, I'd love to go down into the root cellar. You know what the root cellar looks like. You open up the big things, you go down. It's so wonderful in there. It smells like apples and onions, and it's moist. I loved it. The dank darkness, I loved it. I would go down there with Maria Luisa. But as Grandma Hazel would see us going towards that place, she would say, now, Sandy, now, honey, you tell Marolisa. You can't go down them steps. You fall down them steps, you hurt yourself. Now, come on, honey, you tell her. And I'd say, yes, Grandma. Now, come on, tell her. And I'd say, Maria Luisa, dice mi abuelita que no podemos ir, pero que despuesito vamos a poder ir. So, Grandma says I can't go, but later on we can go. So, so I started to be a writer then. I know that, and that memory of Maria Luisa, that memory of that woman who had left her family and come for 3 months to stay on a hot summertime in Unionville, Missouri, who had only the creek that ran in our back by the way back by the ponds and behind the ponds and everything. That was where she took a bath. And she'd be in her white slip, and she'd sit in the water and take her bath. Of course, we didn't have running water at the farm either, so I'd sit there with her. I remember Maria Luisa so much. I remember that froth of black hair she had, her intense eyes, black eyes. I remember her place to stay was in the, we had like a shed. And so there was a cot in there for Maria Luisa. And she brought a votive candle of the Virgen de Guadalupe from Mexico. And we would light that periodically. And she also brought a little nugget of copal, and she would burn that also. But she had to ration it because, we were going to be there 3 months. And of course, there was no Copal in Unionville, Missouri. There was no Virgen de Guadalupe voted in Unionville, Missouri. So I was preparing myself to be a writer way back then. Because how do you prepare yourself to be a writer? You have to be curious, by being sensitive, by listening to stories, by reading stories, by telling stories, and in so doing, remembering and imagining and then inventing. This preparation for being a writer continued when I lived in Mexico and El Salvador. When I was 10 and 11, I'd take Mercedes, was my nana, my nursemaid. I called all my nursemaids nanas because they were all like, all the people who worked in my house. There were 4 servants in my house in El Salvador and Mexico, in both places. And I called them all Nana because they were just like mothers to me, like little mothers to me. And Mechas, one of the Nanas, would take me downtown in the bus to downtown San Salvador, and I'd visit La Librería Ibérica, where I'd buy the latest magazines. And I just loved the newest love story by Corín Tellado. I mean, he wrote stories forever. Of course, they were sort of like the Nancy Drew stories that really weren't written by who we thought wrote them. But once again, when I got home, the servants gathered around the kitchen table, and I'd read the latest Corín Tellado story to them. Because those women could not read and write. And they were people who had left their villages, who'd left their families, their children, and come to the capital to work for people like us. And I remember so well, again, in that soft wax area of my heart, having the nanas come to me, Niña Sandy, por favor escríbame una carta. Write a letter for me, Niña Sandy. Léame esta carta. I just got a letter. Read this letter for me. And I do it because I thought it was my duty to do it, because I could and they could not. But I also did it because I was curious to know what was in those letters. And also because I was writing, when I wrote a letter, I could sort of flourish, give it a little flourish and maybe add some nice details, to what they had to say. I continued for many years to read to Las Nanas. And when I did sat down to sit at the servants' table and take these stories down, I took my duty very, very seriously, because Las Nanas would sit there very sort of ramrod in the chair, their arms together, and they'd start. They'd start the letter, and they'd start, espero que al recibir esta carta todos estén bien de salud. I hope that when you receive this letter, everybody's in good health. I mean, they'd start very formally like that. Almost all letters in Spanish back then were started with those words. And then they'd, so slowly, as they started to tell what they wanted me to put in the letter, they'd sort of soften up, and pretty soon their hearts showed. And I would get to understand, and I would get to know, not understand, what their lives were like working in the capital for people like us. And I felt conflicted at 10, 11, 12. I felt terribly conflicted because on the one hand, these nanas who were sweet and dear and cariñosas, living in our house, had families that they had left. They were sad. They were lonely. And at that age, I couldn't quite understand the difference between their lives and the lives then of the people I went to school with. My compañeras, my compañeros, people from the oligarchy, and especially in El Salvador, people who own most of the plantations in El Salvador, and people who had many servants too. And I would go to school on one reality and then come home to the nanas and live another reality. These things too came and settled in my heart. And so every one of their stories every one of their letters brimmed with stories. And they were their own true stories that they were telling me. And by writing them down, I saved them in my heart. I'm pretty sure that it saved them too to have these letters put down and then sent to their families. That in the telling, something softened in them and something healed in them as they were telling me these stories. It's what I've learned after being a writer for almost 25 years. The saving grace of story. How it is that our stories can save us. When I was 14, living in El Salvador, my father, the Missourian, Jimmy Abels, decided that it was time to Americanize me. He said, living in El Salvador, you are, and having come from Mexico and then El Salvador, you are very spoiled. I was totally spoiled. I didn't have to do anything at home. That was the servant's job. I didn't have to wash my clothes. I didn't even have to put my clothes away. The clothes miraculously clean clothes were in the drawers. La comida, dinner, lunch was served. And Daddy said, I think it would be good for you to go to Unionville, Missouri, and go to high school in Unionville, Missouri. And this was 1955. I went to Unionville, Missouri. I was excited because I had been reading. The only thing that I could get in Salvador, my grandmother, Grandma Hazel, who could not speak to Maria Luisa, used to send comic books in big packages to Salvador. And I loved the Archie and Veronica ones, because I loved the fact that they went to high school and that they had their books in their arm, and then Archie would hold the books. And I loved the fact that they had crinolines, and I loved the fact that they had penny loafers and all these things. This was in the 50s, mid-50s. In El Salvador, things were very formal. Girls never wore dungarees or slacks or anything like that. You wore dresses and you wore nylons and you wore heels, and after sundown you wore things that were dark colored. You didn't wear things that were vibrantly colored. I mean, the regimen and the protocol of social life in El Salvador is very well drawn, and you did not step around it. So I was looking with great longing to Archie and Veronica. So I was excited about going to Unionville, Missouri. I was not excited about leaving my family. And when I arrived to the farm in Unionville, Missouri, we were living then in the old house. This house was built about around the time of the Civil War, and it was almost 100 years old. It was 2 stories. It had a big pot-bellied stove, the stove in the front room, one of those big monsters, with the isinglass and the nickel corners, and you fed it the big logs, and that was the heating for the whole house. We had my room was up on the upstairs where there were 2 bedrooms that conformed to the pitch of the roof, so we had sort of a slanted roofs up there. It got very cold up there because the heat didn't quite reach up there. So Grandma was very good to me. She gave me, and I had to spend the winter here because now I'm going to school and high school here, Unionville High School. And I'd never seen snow. I've never been cold, that cold. Not so cold that when you wake up you can see your breath in the room. Grandma gave me the big feather bed, which they stored. I never quite understood the storing of the feather bed, because if it's so darn cold, why don't you get out the feather bed? But Grandma took it out for me, a special occasion, and I used it all that winter. She'd also give me 2 rubber hot water bottles that we'd fill up in the reservoir on our wood stove. We didn't have any electricity, and I would sleep with a hot water bottle at my feet and one right over my chest, And I was very cozy as long as I kept in the feather bed. But in Unionville, Missouri, I suppressed my Latino heritage. All I wanted to be was, when I was in Unionville, Missouri, I wanted to be a farm girl just like everybody else. I did not. We lived on a dairy farm, Grandma and Grandpa's dairy farm. Hard scrabble, hard way to make a living, and I wanted to be like everybody else. So I did not speak Spanish, of course. Who to speak it with? No one. Anyway. Very infrequently did I ever was able to speak over the telephone to my family because they lived in El Salvador, and the calls between Unionville and El Salvador, well, they were unheard of. And also, I didn't get to practice my religion because it was mostly Protestant there. And anyway, I was just separated from my cultura, from my own stories. I was excited about being there, but I was also lonely, and I was also sad because, in essence, I never lived with my family again. I'd go home for the summers and just stay the summer. But after high school was ended, I went back and went to Truman State University, which was then Northeast Missouri State Teachers College. And so I never lived with my family full-time again. So when I was 39 and working at this place in Minneapolis, I had this impulse to write. And I was 39 when I began, so I was really a late bloomer. And I enrolled in this evening class that I told you about, and it was there that I realized that these stories of Las Nanas had collected there. But what I did not do when I was when I was living in Minnesota is I started this writing group. I started to write a novel. You know, I told you I was doing really well with little vignettes, and then I decided to write a novel. So I did. I wrote a novel set in Missouri, and it's a novel that takes place on the farm, and it's a young girl, and she lives on a dairy farm. You know, much like I'd been living. And I wrote this novel, and it took me 3 years to write it. And I went to Vermont to Breadloaf's Writers Conference. I got in. It was a miracle. They accepted me. And so I was excited because I had this novel that I'd written. It was like a mystery story. I went to Middlebury College, Vermont. I went, and 3-4 days after we were there, we had the review and the critique by the famous writer of all of the participants. And I took my novel. They had seen my novel. The guy, who I won't mention his name, who was my critic, who critiqued my novel, told me, and I'll say this in a different way, but you get the message. He said that my novel was flushable. Get it? The S word, you know. And in other words, he said that my novel was shit, okay? So those were his words. I mean, I say that because those were his words. And then he spent like an hour telling me, see, in this scene, and this scene, and this scene, and this scene, and this. I left so dispirited, so despondent. I'd been working 3 years. My husband, who is way back there at the back of the room and drove me here, he told me when I started to write that novel, quit your work at Wilson Learning Corporation, where I was working, and I will support you until you get published. And this was going to be my big thing, you know. I went to Breadloaf, and this novel is flushable, you know. So I came home, and of course I went to bed for about 2 weeks. You know, I was just so upset. I said, I'm going to quit writing. Jim says, you can't quit writing. You can't stop. You've invested 3 years. And my children said, you can't stop, Mom. And my writing group, you can't stop, Sandy. And so during that time that I was lying on that bed, despondent, I said to myself, wait a minute, maybe he's right. That guy was right. That novel was not publishable. That novel didn't come from anywhere deep in my soul, something deep that had happened to me, that had impressed me. That was just some kind of commercial effort at some kind of mystery that didn't work. So if I wanted to write, I said to myself, I need to write from that area inside my heart where the Nana stories were, where the people who could not read and write were, where the people of Salvador, the people that I saw in contrast to the haves and have-nots, I had not realized how impressed I had been and affected I had been by these women. And so I started to write then from that spot. And I began to do what Joseph Campbell said to his students: follow your bliss. In order to be happy, follow your bliss. Do what you have passion to do. And think about that. What do you have the passion for, and do it. And having the passion to do something means to pay your dues doing it, to work at doing that. A lot of people being a writer is hard work. It's more than anything else is hard work. It's rewarding work, but it's very difficult. And sometimes every time I write, and I have five books. Every time I've written a new book, it's the same thing all over again. I have to get myself, sort of ready to get into it, to write another novel, because I don't know where I'm going with the novel. I write, it's a character that comes to me, and I want to follow that character, and I have to sort of let my imagination go and follow that character until that character becomes real, and then the character can tell me where it is that he's going. That's what happened to me with Nicolás de la Virgen Veras in The Weight of All Things. Nicolás came to me, and he said, you wrote a novel. When I say came to me, I mean, like cosmic. I don't mean like he was a real person. He came to me and he said, you wanted to write about the war in El Salvador when you wrote Bitter Grounds. You started the war in Bitter Grounds in 1932 with the first so-called communist uprising in the Americas, when the campesinos rebelled and revolted against the patrones on the coffee fincas for their human rights, and the novel ended in 1977. It didn't get into the war times in El Salvador, and so I thought to myself, well, I needed to finish that novel, and I did, because already it had been like 500 and some pages. And so Nicolás came to me, remember you wanted to write about the war? I will tell you about the war. My name is Nicolás de la Virgen Veras, and if you want to write about the war in El Salvador, I will tell you the war through my eyes when I was 9 years old. And so I followed Nicolás, and he filled my heart, and I wrote the book. You have to be a writer, you have to also have the passion to do the work, but you have to have the passion for words, the passion for stories, for something important happening to somebody somewhere, because that's what good writing is. It's something happening, something important happening to somebody somewhere. And following that story will lead to some kind of change, to some kind of transformation. So it's why I write, to discover the mystery in the lives of everyday people. And it was Latino stories that interest me the most. In fact, knowing that I'd be focusing on this, I took my mother's maiden name. My mother was Marta Benitez de Abels, and I was Sandy Abels. And I decided that if I was going to write Latino stories, I would take my mother's maiden name. Of course, I went to Daddy, and I asked Daddy permission for taking my mother's maiden name, as we dutiful daughters do. And my father said, of course you could take Martita's name. It's the most beautiful name in the world. I mean, my mother was his beloved. And so I began then to write as Sandra Benitez, La Latina, and not Sandy Abels, the Gringa. And it was by writing then and telling Latino stories that I began to reclaim my Latina heritage. The heritage that had been so far from me and so far away from me from the time I was 14 and was sitting on that farm and working and watching people work on that farm, because I was just still spoiled. And Grandma did spoil me in her own way. She didn't make me milk the cows. Well, I tried to milk the cows once, but I kept squeezing the tit up instead of down, so the cows would sort of sit on there. The only thing she said we had to do, we had an outhouse and a two-seater. I never could understand the sharing. Never could. I I didn't want anybody in there with me. And anyway, I got in there and out of there so fast because who knows what's down in there, you know. And so one of the things you had to do, it didn't matter if I was Sandy Abels and she was being nice to me, is I had to empty that thunder bucket that was under my bed, you know, in the wintertime when you don't want to, you go out to the outhouse. So, and I used to do it right before school. I remember one time I went out there, and one thing you have to do if you're going to do that is you might want to check the direction of the wind. And I was wearing the whole pot, you know. I didn't get to go to school that day because the bus was coming. And just as I made that fatal toss. But again, that's stuff, you know, that's material. So I took my mother's maiden name. And that's when I started to feel Latina again. And though I was then started at 39, 13 years passed before I was published. I was 53 when I finally became published. And so writing is about perseverance. Writing is about tenacity. Writing is about working hard. Goethe, the German writer and philosopher, says, whatever you can do or dream you can do, begin it. And that's why I say in all my talks, I say, it's never too late to begin. It's never too late to begin. I started at 39. I was published at 53. There are some of you out there in the audience who might be wanting to write. People who are older who think, oh, you know, the time has passed. But when you do begin to write, you will know that it's just that you've started at the right time. It happened for me. So why did it take me so long to be published? Because I had to write and rewrite and write again. I had to learn by writing. I had to learn to be a good writer, then a better writer, then I had to learn to write my best. But it also was in the late 80s and early 90s, and the stories of La Otra America, of the other America, were frequently passed over. I had to be patient. I had to wait for writers such as Isabel Allende and Sandra Cisneros and Cristina Garcia to open up the publishing doors to stories such as mine. And my first novel, A Place Where the Sea Remembers, is a book set in Mexico. It was turned down a dozen times before it was published in 1993. And then when the book came out, everything changed for me. The novel won awards. The novel was translated into 5 languages. Now it's translated into 8. It was optioned for a movie. And this good fortune spurred me on to write more books. And things have changed so much since that time. I mean, Los Latinos are the largest minority in the United States. And Latino stories, all publishing houses are hungry for Latino stories. I want to tell you about, let's see. I see my time is coming to a close, and then I'll take questions from you. In one of my books, A Place Where the Sea Remembers, one of the figure of the curandera, the healer woman, who is the woman who carries the story of all the people in my book, A Place Where the Sea Remembers. And she says it is stories that save us, she says, our own true stories. In telling them, there is the power to inform, the power to illuminate, and ultimately the power to save. And save us from what? Save us from invisibility. Another curandera in Night of the Radishes, my novel, the 4th novel, Night of the Radishes, her name is Doña Clarita. And she says an important thing. She says, a true story is a story no matter what language is used to convey it. And it's not so much the story's content that's important. What is important is that they be told, that they be brought up from the heart, pushed out by the breath, released into the air, free to mingle and collide with all the other stories permeating the air around us. It's where stories belong, outside us, not trapped and calcified within, weighing us down like sea anchors. We, los Latinos Americanos, have our own true stories that call us to be told. Be you mexicano, salvadoreño, puertorriqueño, colombiano, be you dominicano, panameño, uruguayo, venezolano, be you chileno, nicaragüense, guatemalteco, peruano, be you a Wisconsinite, an Iowan, a Minnesotan, a Missourian, be you of English, Irish, Scandinavian, or German descent, start by remembering. In Spanish, the word for remember is recordar. And if you break that word apart, re, again, from the Latin again, cordar, cordis, from the heart. So to remember really is passing things back through our heart. Remember through remembering to get to that heart place where all your stories are stored. And so it is, you sit around your family table, your friend's table, the neighbor's table, a table at the local Starbucks, or walking with friends for an afternoon walk. You pass stories back through your heart, push them up by your breath, and release them into the air. Barry Lopez, in his marvelous fable, Crow and Weasel, says, "Remember this one thing," said Badger. "The stories people tell have a way of taking care of them. If stories come to you, care for them. Learn to give them away as they are needed. Sometimes a person needs a story more than food to stay alive. That is why we put stories in each other's memories." And I say it's the way we save ourselves, the way we become visible, by sharing our own unique personal story. We need faith, courage, trust. We need a heap of love to acknowledge our own story, to accept the uniqueness of who we really are. So whoever you are, wherever you may be, your own true stories call out to you. Your own true stories restore and preserve who you really are. To finish, and before I take questions, I'd like to read a poem that I wrote in 1993 for the St. Paul Foundation in Minnesota. It's a project that installed poetry and cultural symbols in a small pocket park overlooking the Mississippi River. I want to read that poem in homage of my Latino heritage. I'll read the poem in Spanish and then in English, and then I'll take your questions. En el sur somos gente de maíz. Años atrás, muchos dieron las espaldas hacia el norte, mientras nosotros empezamos la dura jornada, nuestros corazones de maíz protegiendo el cruzar. Ya aquí comprendimos una grave realidad. La frontera verdadera no es el río. La frontera verdadera no es el río. Es la larga sombra que nos echa el pasado. Una y otra vez nuestra gente nos llama sin cesar. In the South, our people are made of corn. Long ago, some turned broad backs on the North, while others trudged toward it, their corn hearts safeguarding the crossing. Once north, we learned a sober truth. The true border is not the river. La frontera verdadera no es el río. It is the long shadows our ancestors cast. They beckon again and again. Muchas gracias. If anybody has questions, a question? Yes.
How did your parents feel about you talking to Las Nanas? Because, like here, you're often told to stay out of grown folks' business. Like, how did they feel about you being so young, conversing with elders?
To tell you the truth, I don't think they even noticed.
Really?
Yeah. Because it was the nanas who took care of us. So if I was with a nana, it would be okay. I'm sure they noticed, but maybe they didn't notice to the, so that they would say that I couldn't do it. No. So it was very good. It was very easy to do. Yeah. Yes.
When you tell a story, how much of the story is something you make up, and how much of it refers to reality, what really happened to people. When you were telling your nana about going into the root cellar, and made up a little bit. You're fictionalizing a little bit.
Exactly.
How much do you fictionalize, and how much is the truth of people's lives, and what responsibility does a writer have in general to report the historical, political, social reality?
Yes. That's a very important question, and something that I struggle with a lot. I think the writer's responsibility is to tell the truth. Truth, of course, I write fiction. I wrote one book that's nonfiction, that is the story of my life in Latin America and here in the States, and my writing life and an illness and everything. That was very hard to write because I had to stick to my not only my emotional truth, but to the events that happened in my life. I mean, I'm thinking of James Fry with A Million Little Pieces and how he exploded the truth in his memoir and really went beyond the beyonds on that. So, but a writer of fiction, the responsibility we have is to keep to the truth of what we are writing. That's the emotional truth, the honesty of what we are writing. Also, if you are writing in the context of as I did, A Place Where the Sea Remembers, well, especially Bitter Grounds and The Weight of All Things that happened within the context of the history of El Salvador, you have to keep, truthful to those events. And I do. I'm very particular and I'm very meticulous with my research. And but also knowing that it's really a fiction book, it's really a book about my characters. And my characters living through that reality in which I have to pay very close attention and write what really happened. But the lives of my characters, I can use myself and my own emotional truth to write about my characters. It's very difficult at first when you're first doing it because you think that everything... That's why that first novel... by the way, I gave that first novel a really nice burial. I bought a nice box in which I put it and all the notes that came to it, and I lighted a candle and said a little prayer over it and thanked it for allowing me to understand what it was to write a novel. And I think that novel failed because I was trying to keep to the reality of my life, the truth of my life. I didn't understand that in fiction we have it's wonderful to be able to leap out of our own life events and go and use our imagination. So it's a matter of remembering and imagining. But the truth, it has to be honest and true emotional, I would say. Did that answer your question? No questions? Yes.
Who are your favorite writers?
I should have stopped. I should have stopped. I am such a voracious reader that I read everything. But Hemingway, for his simplicity, his directness of language. Steinbeck, for his wonderful sense of place. These are the writers who have influenced me, okay? For his sense of place and for his great heart. I think Steinbeck has. Garcia Marquez. Because there's no one like Garcia Marquez to tell a story. And I love the way, if you could write a paper comparing Marquez to Hemingway, they're both macho men. But the way one goes about it and the other goes about it, Marquez is like a labyrinth, He writes in circles, and he starts here and he goes, but he always ends up. We always are following him. We can understand him. But the richness, the density of his pages, the depth, and Hemingway, the quickness of his prose. Now, those are three men. And let's say Neruda. There's nothing better for me when I'm writing fiction than to read poetry. Because poetry gives me the image. Poetry demands that I go for the image. Poetry demands and trains my head to look for the metaphor. So Neruda, there's nothing I loved in Spanish, and then who I love in English, the poets I love the poets whom I understand. So, I'm talking about Linda Pastan, and I'm talking about I see this happens to me. A lake in my head. Jane Hirschfield. I love Jane Kenyon. Anyway, a lot of poetry. And then, a lot. I read a lot of fiction, and I read a lot of memoir, and I read a lot of nonfiction too. I mean, I really couldn't point out, but those three writers that four really, Neruda, Marquez, Hemingway, and Steinbeck, really affected and are directly responsible for the way I write. Yes.
Do you still visit Unionville in El Salvador and visit your friends and stuff?
I do. And Unionville is still the same. Is anybody here from Unionville? Does anybody here know where Unionville is? Yeah, I do. I go to my high school reunions. I haven't gone for about 3 years because it's been that at the time my books are coming out, at the time that the high school reunion, which is in September at the same time where the fair is, and I'm on tour and I haven't been able to go for the last 3 years, so I'm looking forward to going back this September. And then I go back to Salvador, not as much as I go to Unionville, of course, but Salvador, the last time I was in Salvador was 2 years ago. And it's changed drastically from the last time I was there, which was in the 70s. Yes?
As a bilingual author, when you're writing in one language, do you ever find yourself wishing that you're actually writing in other language, and maybe you prefer the expression in one language or a complex idea that
Yes, thank you for that question because it does bring up a point. I write in English. I do not write in Spanish. However, all my books, all the characters in my books are leading their lives in Spanish. So in order to write those books, the story comes to me in a Spanishness. I can't quite explain to you how that is. That's why the language, sometimes in my writing group they used to say, Sandy, heightened diction, because I would get really florid with my writing. But in the Spanish language we are florid. We're deliciously florid. But in English it doesn't translate well. It gets tedious. And so I had to, that's why Hemingway helped me to combat that. One short declarative sentence, So anyway, I write my books with a Spanishness. And that's why sometimes in the sieve, that is the language sieve, some of the Spanish doesn't make it through the little sieve and stays. And so that goes into the text as Spanish. And it also as a reminder to the reader that this is all the things that are taking place in this book are taking place in Spanish. This is not taking place in English. Somebody else over here had their hand up? No? Did I dream it?
Could you tell us about
Wait a minute. Yes? Go ahead. Go ahead.
When you were young,
Yeah?
and you moved in Unionville,
Yeah?
how were you accepted, or what were kind of the attitudes and feelings being a young girl from, coming from El Salvador, coming from Mexico, and the culture in the United States at that time? How were you accepted?
Great question, because
Did that have any effect in your writing as far as that goes?
great question, because I was the foreigner. I was the foreigner, and really that's what they called me, the foreigner. I came from, my God, not even outside of Missouri, way outside of Missouri, and so I was looked as an anomaly, and I was looked upon as somebody strange. But I am a show-off, so I like that. In other words, I had their attention. And so I made the most of that. But I remind you that I tried very hard to be because it was disconcerting, and I did not like that. And so I tried to be as just like everybody else and be the little farm girl, and drop my proper English way of speaking and why, honey. And sometimes when I go down to Unionville, I slip right back into it. Well, you guys, what are you doing? Yeah, I'm Missouri again. I'm probably doing Minnesota right now. Yes.
How have your books been received in Mexico and El Salvador?
In El Salvador, I don't know about Mexico, but I do know for sure. I was very worried about the Bitter Grounds coming out in El Salvador when it was translated into Spanish, because I was sure I was going to get shot by the guerrilla or something. But because I did not take sides, and because I didn't proselytize about either the right or the left, actually I've won a prize in the literature of El Salvador, and my book is considered a important read in Salvador, which I'm very happy about, because I really thought at one time I might be bumped off. Stranger things have happened. So, yes.
Do you translate your books in Spanish yourself, or?
Yeah, no, I don't translate my books myself. What happens is your publisher buys the English version of the book and in the version in which it was written, and then other foreign publishers. They go to the publisher, American publisher goes, and the agent goes to a fair in Frankfurt, Germany every fall, and at that fair they show the books they have, and then everybody from Europe comes, or around the world comes to that fair, and then they buy the rights for translation of the books, and that's what happens. So I don't have anything to do with the translations and of any of my books. Yes.
Do you ever read the books after they've been translated in Spanish and see problems and be upset at some of the ways that they're translated?
That's why I haven't read them. No. Well, and I figure I've been translated into Dutch, German, French, Italian, Portuguese, Icelandic, just the other day, and something else I can't remember. But I can't read those languages. So it's like making a movie. Every time that they come to option a movie, I have to remove myself, because if I sign the rights over for the movie, I have to get out of the way, because it's not my book. My book is my book, and the movie is the movie. You can't get in there and try to control that, because you can't control it. So that's why, no, I haven't read my books, even in Spanish. The only one I read was A Place Where the Sea Remembers. That's the only one. And I found it to be beautiful. Yes. Tips.
I would say, yeah. Since you were 39 when you found your true love, what would you tell us? What can we do to find something that motivates us?
Okay. Yes, I can. I have some. I do have some tips.
Okay.
I think it's very important, and this is going to sound cosmic to you. Okay. I think it's very important that you have times of silence. You have times when you're totally alone, without no music, nothing, just alone, almost so that you can start asking yourself, what is it that you desire to do? In this world of so many opportunities, what is and pay attention to what is your passion. Pay attention to what makes you happy. Pay attention to what you're good at. Pay attention to what challenges you. And it doesn't matter what it is. I mean, follow your bliss and everything will come. And then you have to work hard at that, and then you have to persevere at that. I mean, 13 years it took me to be published. I can't tell you how. The professor talked about the story when I was about 13 years. I was getting ready to give up, and I came back from Fargo, and there was that message: blink, 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 blink. I want to buy your novel. 13 years I had to wait. So I think it didn't occur to me to be quiet, to listen to myself, to ask myself questions, to write lists about what I love, what do I love to do. Write lists. Write lists about I hate this. I love this. Learn about yourself, your innermost self. I mean, it's cosmic and it's maybe weird, and you probably think, but if you do spend that time doing that, at least you'll come up with some answers, and that you can maybe try to figure out where you want to go, because there's nothing worse than spending your time in college, your time, effort, money in college, and then graduating with something that you hate. And this is a great opportunity to go to college. And there's a lot of opportunities here that will guide you in the direction of the place you want to go to. So pay attention to yourself, your own voice. Okay. Well, I thank Professor Bar Melech for inviting me here tonight. I thank all of you for coming out and staying so late for me here. And I appreciate more than I can say that you use my work here. Thank you very, very much. Buenas noches.